Hello students, welcome to San Academy-Pallikaranaai. Today we are going to discuss about chapter 12 friction from class 8 science. Let us start our journey. Topics to be covered in this lesson are introduction, what is friction, factors affecting friction, friction is a necessary evil, increasing and reducing friction and fluid friction. Introduction of friction, the unknown force. Students, you might have seen a driver of a car or a truck slowing down the vehicle at a traffic signal. You too slow down your bicycle whenever needed by applying brakes. Have you ever thought why a vehicle slows down when brakes are applied? Not only vehicles, any object moving over the surface of another object slows down when no external force is applied on it. Finally, it stops. Have you not seen a moving ball on the ground stopping after some time? Why do we slip when we step on the banana peel? Why is it difficult to walk on the smooth and wet floor? You will find the answers to such questions in this chapter. Shall we start? Yes.
Now, what is friction? Friction is nothing but it is also a force that slows down moving objects or prevents stationary objects from moving. Right? Frictional force arises when two substances contact each other. Now, we can see one example. A ball is moving in a particular direction. See why? Because you are giving applied force to the ball. So why the reason the ball after a moment it comes to rest? The reason is nothing but some kind of force which is also acting in the opposite direction. That force we called it as what? Frictional force. Got it? So the main reason why the object which is come to rest when two substances contact each other. We have discussed about in the previous chapter the contact and non-contact force, right? So mainly the frictional force which is acting contact forces or contact surfaces. That means they are talking about the surface of the ball and also the surface of the floor, right? So mainly why the reason the ball is comes to rest depending the surface of both, right? I'm talking about both is nothing but the ball and the surface. Friction is the force that resists the motion of an object or surfaces. That means you can see here a block which is you are going to consider, right? So this block which is contact with the surface of this floor. So just assume this is hot surface. Okay, this is hot surface. So I'm going to, this is hot surface. What happened to the friction force? Definitely the friction force is maximum. Because of the reason it opposes the motion of an object. Definitely it opposes motion of the object because the surface of the block which is contact with the surface of the floor. Right? So what we are assume here, that is we consider the hot surface of the floor. Right? So if you are giving a push to this direction, what happened to this block? Slowly it will move because if you are considering hot means the frictional force is maximum. That means the opposite of the reaction which is maximum. And also one more thing, the friction always works in the direction opposite from the direction of the object is moving or trying to move. That means if you are giving applied force or pushing force in this direction, always you should consider the frictional force is opposite direction, right? It always slows the moving objects down. The reason behind here I told you clearly, contact between the surfaces. Now, what causes friction? The main reason is interlocking of irregularities is the major cause of the opposition force of friction. You can see we are considering the block and the surface. If you are check the surface of the block, there is some irregularities in the surface. So definitely the interlocking will be happen with the surface, right? So the interlocking irregularities is the major cause of the opposition of force of friction. I said clearly the hot surface if you're considering means definitely it opposes motion. Also the irregularity on the surface of the block or a surface, definitely the frictional force will act in the opposite direction, right? And when two surfaces are put in contact, the irregularities of one surface get somewhat interlocked with the irregularities of the other surface. Exactly, because you can see here something irregularity surface which is held here. So that means there is some force. If it is in a motion of the block, definitely the frictional force acting in the opposite direction, right? This may be regarded somewhat similar to the interlocking of saws, right? Force has to be applied to unlock the interlocking of the two surfaces, that means in contact, and thereby to enable them to move with respect to each other. So we need to give a more force to the direction, or more applied force to the particular direction, so it will move, right? So exactly you need a maximum force that you have to move the object. Got it? Factors affecting friction. Mainly depends on the extent of roughness or smoothness. That means if you're considering any rough surface, that means hard surface. Okay, hard surface means hard floor. Okay, so I'm going to keep any block. I'm giving applied force to this block. So what happened to this? Definitely it will not move, because very hard surface means the interlocking irregularities will happen. So you need to give a maximum applied force to this direction, which tends to move in a particular direction of the block. Got it? So what it means? That means it opposes the motion of a block. That means the friction is very, very greater when considering the very hot surface. Got it? When you are considering very smooth surface, the friction is less. That means the sliding will happen. The sliding or slippery will happen on the smooth surface. So the friction is very less. This is very, very important concept of frictional force. Got it? Next up, the friction depends on the nature of the surface and contact. So mainly what we have to consider the frictional force, mainly we have to consider the roughness or smoothness on the surface, and friction depends on the mass of the moving object. And if it is even smooth surface, the object which has a maximum mass, definitely we need a maximum applied force, and you have to give a maximum applied force to the object. So mainly what they are saying, it depends the nature of the surface in contact, and also we have to consider the mass of the moving object. Types of friction. There are different kinds of friction. Now we are going to discuss about static friction. Static friction is nothing but, static means in physics term we can say it's rest. Okay, so it's rest. Suppose you consider a block. So you just see this is the block, you just giving the applied force to this block. uh, if you're considering the surface, if it is very hot, definitely the block will not move. Means you should consider there is no motion at all for the object, right? And also, even if you're considering a heavier mass to the particular object, if it is not in the moving, even if you're applying a force, so that kind of force or that kind of friction, we call it as what? Static friction. There is no motion at all if you are giving a applied force to the particular object, right? So one of the most common types of friction is what? Static friction. This kind of friction happens when an object is moved along the surface on which it is resting. The surface resists the movement of an object. So the surface will definitely, it will not give to the motion of an object. Means we have to consider that friction is called what? Static friction. That means the object is at rest. Got it? So the direction of the force is opposite to the direction of motion of an body. That means if you are giving a applied force, the friction force is opposite to the direction of the body. Now we have sliding friction. This type of friction takes place when two objects that are solid comes to in contact. That means if you're considering the surface, also the block, what happened to this? Comes to rest after it's sliding over it, right? So in this friction, force is applied to an object for sliding it against each other. So the sliding friction also opposes the motion. Somewhat it opposes the motion. So most of the times the surface is flat. So this kind of sliding friction will happen in the flat surfaces, right? So this kind of friction is what? Weaker than the static friction. So static friction is maximum opposing motion. So we have to consider the static friction is maximum when compared to sliding friction. Got it? Sliding friction. Got it? So this is why it is hassle free to slide an object once start moving. A great example of sliding friction is that when you use a pencil to write, you are using sliding friction. The lead of the pencil can easily slide over the paper. The friction between the paper and the pencil is more than enough to leave an impression. Now we have a rolling friction. Rolling friction is nothing but the force of friction that comes into play when a one body rolls over the surface of the another body. So here this is actually in a rolling motion, right? So this if you are giving applied force to this cylinder or whatever kind of a rolling object like a car wheel, okay, so in that condition it opposites a motion of a body, right? It opposites a motion of a body. So that motion what we called it as, or that frictional force what we called it as rolling frictional force. The area of contact in case of rolling friction is smallest as compared to the static friction or rolling friction. So you can see the static friction is maximum when compared to sliding friction and compared to rolling friction. So static friction is what? It opposes maximum. Even if you are giving applied force, definitely it will not change its position. So definitely we can assume that the force is acting in the opposite direction, right? And sliding friction somewhat it's greater than rolling friction. So rolling friction is very lesser when compared to sliding friction and static friction. Friction is a necessary evil. Friction plays an important role in our day-to-day life. In some cases, friction is useful and necessary. Yes, exactly, because without friction, we can't walk on the floor, right? If it is friction only, if it is, the friction will be there, means we can easily walk on the floor. In other cases, it causes wastage of energy and damages moving parts of the machinery. So, friction between the feet and the ground help us to walk on the ground. So, walking on the ground for rolling, everything friction is very important. It is possible to write with a pencil or pen on a paper due to friction between the pen or pencil and the paper. It is possible to write on the blackboard due to friction between the chalk and the blackboard. Friction between the tires and the road helps automobiles to move on the roads. Friction between the bricks helps in the constructing of buildings. So many applications we can say for frictional force, because without friction we can't do anything, because we need a friction, because if you are not having a much friction, definitely you will slip down. Friction is sometimes undesirable and evil or nuisance. Soles of shoes wear out due to friction. So you can see the soles of shoes wear out due to friction. Tires of bicycles and automobiles wear out due to friction. So this also which is happening due to friction only, because continuously the tire which is actually rolling between the surface of the road and also the surface with the tire, so it loses its wear, that means the frictional force, right? And it steps off a staircase and foot over bridges in railway stations wear out due to friction. Exactly. So knives or razors lost their sharp edges due to friction. Methods of increasing friction. Some kind of the machinery parts, if you are using automobiles, we need the frictional kind of tools also. That means with the help of reeds and grooves, we can increase the roughness of the surface. And also method of reducing friction, that is polishing when your lubrication doing like liquids or semi-liquids, grease and solid as a talcum powder. You can see in the carom board you need a maximum smoothness, means you have to pour a powder. That means you should decrease, or you are reducing the frictional force on the surface between the coin and also the surface of the carom board. Got it? So ball bearing also one of the reducing frictional force. Now we have fluid friction. Fluid friction. Fluid means nothing but it's a flow of substance like a air or a water level. Okay, so that is what fluid we are called it as, air or water. That means flow of substance. Okay, so air or water, we called it as fluid. And we can also consider for the fluid friction. So fluid friction, which is we have to consider for air level and water level. Any bird which is flying in the at the top surface, definitely there is some kind of high air resistance will happen, because when it is moving in a particular direction, definitely some kind of fluid friction will oppose its motion. So for that we need to give a maximum applied force, so that what we call it as fluid friction. So the air also exerts friction, that is good. That's what we call it as air resistance. Fluids exerts force friction, or fluid or drag, we call it as drag force. So collective term for liquid and gases also it will happen. So that's what we call. That's what I told you. That means the flow of substances, right? Fluid friction mainly depends the nature of the fluid, shape of the moving object, that means area of contact, speed of the moving object with respect to the fluid. Thank you.